So it's generally been thought that human beings have been conducting trades and transfers of assets for at least 8,000 years. And that's always been a very friction-full process, right? I mean, if I got a load of cattle that I want to trade you for a load of lumber, I got to haul my cattle over to your place, we got to agree on a price and make the exchange. It's really been hard to do that. It wasn't until the 7th century BCE when the kings of Lydia started, measuring out quantities of gold and stamping them with their seal of approval that people actually started to have fairly frictionless trade. It was very important because that little lump of metal created trust between the parties, and I can now carry around a sack of gold, coins, and then I wouldn't have to, bring all my goods if we were doing an exchange. Now these days we've traded in those sacks of gold for these, little slips of paper, these fiat currencies, but essentially they serve the same role. There's a level of trust in the government that issues them, more or less, but we can make the exchange in that manner, so all is good that way. And also think about writing, right? The history of writing. Writing has been around almost as long as people have been making trades, and I, for one, think that writing was invented strictly to start to keep track of those trades. If you look at some of the earliest clay tablets and examples of writings that we have, they're nothing more than inventories of assets and trades. So human beings love to trade, and they love to record those trades, and it's been that way since civilization started out. Now today the process is pretty simple and straightforward. It's pretty much the same as it's always been. I've got a bunch of these in my pocket, you've got something I want, we agree on the price, we have a level of trust in the unit of exchange. I give you my money, you give me the goods, we scribble in our books, and we go on our way. And that's been pretty much a good frictionless way of doing trade. But the problem is if you're expected to carry around a sack of money or wad of bills, there's always the risk that you could get robbed and be removed of your money, if you will. So we started using these little pieces of plastic, right, that have no particular intrinsic value, credit card transactions. And what happens here is we need to now have an intermediary or a third party come in and create that level of trust. So now we're relying on a banking system to say, I trust this piece of credit, so you as a vendor will accept it, and I know I have the convenience of giving it to you instead of money. And this is all well and good as well, except now that intermediary charges a fee, right? They charge a fee on the transaction, and they also charge me interest if I don't give them the money right at the same time. And even though the transaction itself is instantaneous, that exchange of assets doesn't occur usually till the end of the month or sometime later down the road. But even still, it's a pretty straightforward transaction. We just have this one intermediary in place. But now I want you to think about a very common transaction that most of you have probably been involved in, and that's the purchase of a house, right? So now you've got the buyer and the seller, you've got the bank that's going to give you the mortgage, but then you've got all these other folks that have to protect the bank's interests. You've got the people who have to go and check on the creditworthiness of me as the purchaser. There are people that have to go and make sure that the title is clean. There are people that have to go and make sure that all kinds of things are in order. So now the number of participants has grown astronomically, and each one of these participants has its own set of books, its own method for leveraging trust, its own mechanism for making this work. Things get very complicated at this point. There are literally thousands of business processes like this out there. The exchange of stocks, the exchange of almost anything of value. We're looking at examples where people want to track the provenance and the value of diamonds, for example. All of these are examples of processes that, even though they've moved to the internet and they've all been digitized, the processes themselves really have never changed, since the early days of commerce. So what we're looking for is some kind of a mechanism where we can create that level of trust, that level of integration amongst all the parties, where these transactions can happen instantaneously or close to instantaneously because everybody agrees that this mechanism of trust is in place. So even though all these processes have become digitized and they moved to the internet, what's missing is that trust vehicle. And it's not a new problem. We've been trying to solve this for many years. The issue has been what's often called the double spend problem, right? I've got this physical piece of paper, and if I hand this to you, then I don't have it anymore and you have it. There's no chance of me spending it twice. But think about what happens when you send something digitally. Let's say a photograph. You've all done photographs at some point. You're never sending the original photograph, you're always sending a copy of it. So every time I create an asset and I send it digitally, it gets copied as opposed to actually physically moving. Now, people have tried to rectify this problem, but all approaches have involved that middleman concept where some third party or some centralized authority has to come in and say, I will vouch for the trust of that asset as long as you pay me, right? Cut of the transaction. It's always the case. Now, this was the problem with this concept of trying to digitize complex transactions until around the year 2008 when somebody under the pseudonym of Satoshi Nakamoto created this paper on a peer-to-peer cashless exchange over the internet, and it turned into what we all know and love as Bitcoin. In this paper, a mechanism based on advanced cryptography was produced such that we could actually have that trust vehicle and we could be able to exchange money or to exchange anything of value without having to have third parties. It was a real breakthrough in terms of internet, and it created this whole uproar that we're talking about as blockchain these days. Now, when I'm talking blockchain, I'm not talking Bitcoin itself, but I'm talking about the underlying technologies underneath Bitcoin, and they're generally considered to be four of them. One is a distributed peer-to-peer shared ledger. So the individual parties don't maintain their own individual ledgers anymore. They share a ledger that they all agree is the source of truth. They all have a mechanism for ensuring that they have consensus over what that source of truth is. There's privacy involved here. Now, when you think about the concept of these networks of transactions, I want some people to see some transactions, but not others, because remember, you're probably dealing with parties that compete in some areas even though they're cooperating in others. So through advanced cryptographic techniques, I can ensure that all parties are only seeing the transactions that are relevant to them. There's the concept of building consensus, as I said, so that we have a mechanism in place such that when a transaction occurs, the mechanism ensures that everybody agrees that it occurs, and then it gets written indelibly into the blockchain such that it can never be removed. And then finally, there's this concept of smart contracts where I can start to embed actual business logic into the blockchain so that once a transaction is approved, that can kick off other business processes to actually make those transfers of assets happen. So it's a very elegant, it's a very unique technology to solving a problem that we've had for many years in the internet. So you have to have been seeing all kinds of stuff and reading all kinds of papers about the wonders of blockchain. You know, greatest thing since sliced bread, it's going to revolutionize industries, it's going to disrupt processes. And all of this is probably true, but my advice for you today is to take a breath, stay calm, and relax. You haven't missed the boat. You have to understand where we are in the process today. We're very, very early in the blockchain adoption process. And in fact, probably for the first time in my career, I'm seeing that we are actually involving customers in the process of building the technology before it's actually gone to market. I mean, we call this the old, you don't ever want to see how the sausage is made problem, but in this case, you are helping us make the sausage, and we're all in this together, we're all working at this point, so we're very early in the process. We have no particular finished product yet. So you haven't missed the boat, but it's time to get started now. And you're starting to see some of this in the press. If you were to look at some analysts, for example, they are, where they were irrationally exuberant at the beginning, we're now starting to see some of them walk back and talk about the fact that, blockchain is going to be something truly disruptive, but we're probably several years out before we actually get to that point. So let's think about doing what you can do today, right? And IBM provides a set of services to help you get started and help you get moving based on where the situation is at this point in time. I would term it the sandbox era, where we are getting into this sandbox, we're starting to play around with the code, trying to get a feel for it, understand what it's like, see what we can build, tear that down, build something else. It's the time of experimentation. And we offer two cloud-based services based on Bluemix that will allow you to do this. The first is basically a starter service, which is intended for developers to get comfortable with the code and understand what we're doing. But for some customers, they want to get beyond that phase. They really want to be leaders in this space. They want to have something that's going to look a little bit more like a production environment, a high secure environment. And for this, we have this high security business network. And I'm mainly going to talk about that in a moment. But first, I want to just give you some commonality between the two services in terms of what's under the covers. You may be surprised by this, but there actually is no one such thing called the blockchain. There are a number of different competing fabrics out there. One you may have heard of before is called Aetherium. Aetherium, in fact, was the first to go beyond Bitcoin and try to build something with a little more business feel into it. But if you really want to understand where Aetherium is, I say go ahead and Google Aetherium hack and see what kind of results come back. There's a real rift in that community right now because of the way it's structured. It really wasn't structured necessarily for business contracts. IBM's been very focused on something through the Linux Foundation called the Hyperledger project. And this is a set of code that we initially gave to the project along with code from other companies. And it in fact is one of the fastest growing open source projects out there today. What we're doing with the Hyperledger project is we're creating a fabric that solves the business issues that are out there. You know, how do I deal with security? How do I deal with peer-to-peer security? How do I deal with the kind of consensus algorithms that are really required here, and things of that nature. So we're riding the Hyperledger fabric, and we think that's the way the industry should go. So just be aware that there is a bit of a competitive feel out there, especially with Aetherium, which is backed by Microsoft, but we think we're going to win with the Hyperledger project. So that's one advantage that both of these services offer. But now if you were to look at the High Secure Business Network, this is really targeting some security concerns that go over and beyond what can be put into code. And what we're doing here is we're trying to allay some of the most frequent fears of people who have to actually go out and deploy these things. The first is what I call the Edward Snowden scenario. I mean, I think we're all pretty familiar with Edward and what he did at the NSA. Edward Snowden was an analyst at the NSA who had high credentials, and he used those credentials to go after data sources that he was not actually authorized to get at. But because of his credentials, he was able to go and do that. If you look at most of the major breaches of security that happen these days, they can almost always be traced back to somebody with high credentials getting in there and taking the data out. So we need to protect against that. We need to protect against those rogue operators getting in and playing around with the service. But even if you trust all of your operators implicitly, even if everybody who has credentials in your environment is implicitly trusted just like you trust the money in your pocket, we think about cyber criminals now. These blockchain networks are highly concentrated areas of value. I mean, think about it. They're holding stocks, they're holding diamonds, they're holding certificates and deeds, all kinds of things of high value. Criminals just love to get into that kind of an environment. So they will target your highly credentialed people, and they'll look to steal those credentials and use those against the company. This is the second largest area of threat that we usually see with most of these hacks. And after we're stopped worrying about those guys, we have to worry about our participants. You know, the participants, as I said, in the network are going to be highly competitive companies in many cases that just happen to be competing on a particular contract. So we want to make sure that they're not spying on each other within our blockchain network. And finally, because all of this is based on very advanced cryptography, we need to make sure that these keys are kept safe and secure and cannot be seen by prying eyes that don't have access to them. So for these reasons, we've built out this high secure business network on services that are exclusively available through the Linux One platform. Things such as secure services container, things such as a hardware secure management crypto card where we actually store the keys. So what we've been able to do is to take that Hyperledger fabric, the code that we're building into these cloud services, and by deploying it on an underlying technology that's Linux One, we're able to now provide these firewalls and these secure services such that the Edward Snowdens of the world can't get in, even if they had the credentials to do so, that the cyber criminals could not get in as well, and that the companies can't get at each other. That's the value that the High Secure Business Network brings to the table, and it's all based and grounded in technologies that are delivered within Linux One. So essentially, at this point in time, I say, jump on that secure blockchain train. It's rolling, it's ready to go. We've got the services in place to help you get started. You didn't miss the train. It's right there at the station. Just get going and start experimenting, and good luck in the future.